Welcome back to our study on the book of John. My name is Dan Tichota, and in this session here, we're going to be looking at chapter 8. We're going to see if we can get through the whole chapter 8 here. Now, the interesting piece about chapter 8 is that in some Bibles, we won't find this first portion that we're going to be looking at. So, let's go ahead and take a look at this chapter here and start by giving a little reminder of what has just happened before. So there was a meeting, the meeting broke up. Now this meeting was to basically again discuss the outcome for Jesus, what we saw in chapter 7, where 3 different times there was the mention made of wanting to arrest him. And it just was not his time yet. So in all 3 of these situations there is not an actual action being taken. It's just discussion about going ahead and arresting him. When we end the chapter 7 here, and we saw that Nicodemus has just stepped up in about how to handle Jesus, and the officials wanted, because again, the officials wanted him arrested. This was the 3rd time listed in chapter 7. And Nicodemus is talking about the legal way of doing things, which would require Jesus having a hearing. The crowd leaves. The meeting is done, and Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives, and this is where we pick up in chapter 8. So I'm going to go ahead and read. And again, in some Bibles, this portion is not here. In most of today's versions, though, it will be listed, and it has some kind of comment, such as my Bible here says that most ancient Greek manuscripts do not include John 7:53 through 8:11. And we'll discuss why here in just a minute. But let's go ahead and start reading this portion. I'm just going to go ahead and read through this whole portion, and then we'll come back and talk about it. So chapter 8, verse 1, it says, Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives, but early the next morning he was back again at the temple. A crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and taught them. Now, I know I said I was going to read it all first. Let me just explain real quick, though, that again, remember, we have just, in chapter 7, we were on the final day of the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, right? So Jesus is coming back to the temple. If we take John literally here, that was on possibly day 8 is what they said. It says on the last day of the feast. And now here's Jesus coming back the next day to teach some more in the temple there. So again, Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives, but early the next morning he was back again at the temple. The crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and taught them. As he was speaking, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. Teacher, they said to Jesus, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say? They were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him, but Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. They kept demanding an answer. So he stood up and again said, all right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone. Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you? No, Lord, she said. And Jesus said, neither do I. Go and sin no more. All right, so let's talk about this passage, because the very famous piece here, we know there's a woman caught in adultery. We don't know what Jesus writes, doesn't tell us, John doesn't tell us, but we know in the end, nobody's around, and Jesus says, I don't condemn you, go and sin no more. What exactly is all those innards that go along with this story? So, again, the controversy, we'll start here with this. The controversy as to why this portion is not in every Bible, and we can go and look at Augustine, his and Ambrose, they both have the same beliefs on this, that this portion should not be in the Bible, because it almost sounds as if Jesus is saying it's okay for her to be caught in the act of adultery. It's okay, like almost as if he's giving permission. But really, if we read this, we don't find that he's giving permission. because in the end, he does tell her, go and sin no more. But some other schools of thought preach the same thing here, that we should not have this in here because it looks as though Jesus is saying, look, don't sin on any of these other sins, but to the woman who did the adultery thing, it's all right. It's all right. It's permissible. That's not, again, what Jesus is saying at all. Right? So that's one of the controversies as to why this is or is not in your Bible there. All right. Other controversies center around the fact of, is it actually in the right place? They do credit the fact that John wrote this and that Jesus actually handled this woman, but did John maybe stick it in the wrong place? And so some of the Bibles, some of the early scripts and all, have it disappearing because they just weren't sure where it actually should go. So again, there's two different reasons as to why this might not be in the Bibles, or at least in the early manuscripts, like mine says, in the early Greek manuscripts. So now let's talk about the actual story, though, because as Jesus is teaching, they bring this woman to him. All right, he's in the temple. He's doing his teachings there. It's almost as if they have disrupted his stuff. And again, from what we see, they are purposely trying to catch him in something that goes against the law. And even though they tried very hard in this situation, we don't find anything where Jesus violates the law, right? If you think about some of these other passages in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we find that Jesus is talking about, hey, he didn't come to get to, or even Paul wrote about this too, that Jesus didn't come to do away with the law, but to what? Basically to show us how we're supposed to live, right? So, again, they're trying to catch Jesus in something, and they did not do a very good job of it. In fact, he kind of pushed it back on them. All right, so while he's teaching, the woman who was caught in adultery is brought forth. They were looking to make this a very public thing. They waited for him to be in the midst of people that he is teaching. They caught her in the actual act, red-handed, all right? Keep that in mind. And then for the catching, there had to be some kind of a prearranged situation going on. So in order for them to have actually caught her, it almost seems as though this was a planned event, right? They didn't really care so much about the fact that she was doing the adultery deed as much as they were maybe using her more as a bait to say, we caught somebody, let's go see what Jesus says. Maybe we can catch him, right? That's kind of what this is all set up like. And it almost gives us the indication that there was spies or some kind of inside workings going on here for them to have been in this position to have caught her red-handed. And so some theologians believe that sure enough, because this was an act that she was caught in the middle of doing, that there might have been some kind of a play from the guy that she was actually having the adulterous relationship with, that he was in on it also. And because of that, that might be why they only brought her and not him also to this little festival or this little meeting, this public humiliation ceremony going on here that they had in mind, right? All right, so there had to have been spies to be able to catch her red-handed, and it wasn't enough for her to just be in the room, right? She couldn't just walk out of the house with the guy. She couldn't just be seen lying in the bed with the guy. In order for this action to have been considered adultery, there had to be someone who was witnessing an actual sexual act happening. All right, so keep that in mind. The law of Moses kind of goes into more depth, and it talks about if you catch someone in the act. It's not, Johnny and Susie, they were, Susie went and spent the night at Johnny's house and they both came out. We don't know if Susie slept on the couch, right? But they're saying that in order for this to be adultery, there has to be someone who witnesses them in an actual sexual act. Okay. Again, this means that if they caught her red-handed, there were either some spies hiding in the closet, which Maybe that's the case. There was some actual spies there. And or the guy was part of this prearranged catching, right? Okay, so keep all that in mind. All right, which tells me that this was a setup. All right, they come and they say, "Hey, we need to stone her. This woman, she did these things, right? And Jesus, the law says that because of this, we must stone her." And notice that Jesus kind of takes his time before he does anything. He doesn't do anything rash, and he had every ability as the one just person in this whole situation. He had the ability to call things as though they were, right? But he takes his time in answering. Notice he gets up and he stoops down and he gets up and he's using these moments maybe to, I don't know, maybe to bait the crowd, but I don't think that's it. I think he's using these moments because he wants to make a point, right? So if we look back here, again, starting in verse 6, they were trying to trap him into saying something that they could use against him, but Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. And again, we don't know what he actually wrote. All right, John doesn't give us any indication. Some people say he wrote their names. Some people say he wrote their sins. All this type of stuff. It might even be that he actually wrote the words of Moses in how this action should be handled. All right, but one of the things that we need to keep in mind as we go back and look at this here is that according to the law, let me find the actual passage that I was referring to in Leviticus 20 verse 10. According to the law, it was not enough to bring just the woman. In fact, if I read this portion here, it says in Leviticus 20 verse 10, it says, "If a man commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, both the man and the woman who have committed adultery must be put to death." Now, why is it that they're only bringing the woman? Again, it leads me to believe, as other theologians have said, that he was probably in on it. That he was the guy who said, "Hey, I'll do it." Right? I mean, that kind of leads me to thinking that aspect there. All right, but Jesus stoops down. He writes something in the dust. And then in verse 7, they kept demanding an answer. "We want an answer. Tell us, oh great rabbi, what are we supposed to do about this? What do you recommend?" Right? Again, they're trying to catch him. So he stood up again and said, "All right, let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone." Now, Jesus is well aware of how this is supposed to work. And again, we don't know what he's writing. We can only assume what he's writing, right? But whatever it is, it was powerful enough for people to start walking away. And notice the order in which they walked away. From the oldest to the youngest is what it says. In verse 8, it says, "Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle." I wish that we knew what he wrote. And again, we can only assume what he wrote there. But his up and down actions, and I need to go back and talk about this, his up and down in verse 6, this is a sign of humility. He is identifying with the woman, which probably has been thrown to the ground, and they're all pointing at her saying, "She was caught in adultery. Take care of this." But notice that Jesus is getting down. We'll go back to verse 6 again. But Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. Then he gets up, because they're demanding an answer, and then he gets back down. And perhaps he is showing his relation with this woman here. And I don't mean that in a mean way, but he's basically saying, I understand. He's getting on her level. I understand what they're doing. I understand what you want. I understand what they're doing. Maybe there's some of that going on in there. Again, the Jewish law said that both of them needed to be there, but why was only the woman brought? So if we look at verse 7, it says, let the one that has no sin cast the first stone. In saying this piece here, Jesus was not speaking against the law of Moses. Again, Jesus knew exactly what they were doing. They were trying to catch him, but he also knew the law said that yes, in a situation of adultery, Moses had spoken this. So it's as if he gives the okay. Yes, according to the law of Moses, we do need to stone her. Let him who has no sin, though, cast the first stone. So he didn't go against the law of Moses in saying this. So I wrote in my notes here, speaking to the ones who orchestrated this and plotted it, they were basically using her as a weapon against Jesus, and they wanted to punish others without taking responsibility for their own sins. Now let's back up a second, because it's quite possible that whatever Jesus wrote convicted them of the piece that they played in this plot. Right? Because if you think about it, what all else happened? There had to be an agreement. Yes, we're going to catch this woman. There had to be them visually seeing this happen. Oh, we're going to get a free peep show. Right? There had to be these different pieces in play in order for this to happen. And perhaps what Jesus is writing down is, as we said before, maybe their names, or maybe their action in this event. And maybe in this, he's calling out their sin and therefore making the comment, let him who has no sin. Maybe there was some kind of bribery. We don't know. Maybe there was some kind of bribery in this whole situation. We're going to pay you if you can help us get this plan in motion so that we can catch Jesus. I wouldn't put it past the Jewish leaders, because isn't that what they did with Judas? Hey, we're going to give you some money if you help us catch Jesus. Why would this not be the same type of situation, right? Hey, we'll pay you some money if you help us. If you get involved in this act of adultery that we're going to try and catch this woman red-handed with and give it to Jesus and see if we can catch him too, we'll give you a little bit of money for it. Almost makes sense, doesn't it? Again, I'm assuming. The text doesn't tell us this. Doesn't tell us what he wrote. But again, think about the pieces there. And maybe Jesus is calling out their sin. And as they begin to realize what they've done, they realize that their sin isn't any different than what she's done. So they all begin to leave. Somehow, whatever Jesus wrote was convicting to them. They became more aware of their own sin. They took responsibility then for their own sin and their piece to play in this, perhaps. And Jesus says, where are your accusers? So that nobody was around now to cast the judgment or to pick up that first stone. In fact, the only one who would have been able to stone would have been Jesus, because he was the only one, based on what he said, let him who has no sin cast the first stone. Jesus was the only one who had not sinned. So Jesus should and could have been the only person to have stoned her. And yet, what does he say in verse 11? Neither do I. I don't condemn you. I'm not going to throw this stone at you. But go and sin no more. And in saying this, go and sin no more, he is saying to her, cease this habit. We don't know how many times she had adultery prior to this moment, or what other things that she had done. But Jesus is saying, cease this habit. When he says, go and sin no more, it is a cease this habit. Stop this action. This is sinful. Stop. And again, if we go back to the beginning, we notice that this happened while Jesus was teaching. So as we move into the next piece, what do we find? Jesus goes back to his teaching. So now, Jesus is going to talk about being the light of the world. And again, what's interesting here is that this probably still around that same time of Sukkot. From what we know here, it's the next day, right? So I told you last week that Sukkot, or in the last session, Sukkot has a lot to do with the time that the Israelites were traveling through the wilderness, right? All right, so keep that in mind. We talked about how they lived in booths, or they lived in these little shelters throughout the wilderness, and God provided. There was the whole pouring of the water piece there that we talked about in our last session. And this is just one of those pieces. Now again, the water represented the times that God gave them water while they were in the wilderness. But in the season of Sukkot, if you go to Israel now, what you will find is that in this season, they live in these temporary shelters. Normally 3 walls and some kind of thatch or something on the top part as their roof there. But it was supposed to be stuff that could easily be picked up and moved. Because why? Because in the wilderness they were following the cloud and the fire. So light has something to do with this ceremony as well. Okay? What they would do in their buildings, if they saw that fire by night was moving, they packed everything up and they moved. So they had to constantly be able to look up. They didn't have a solid roof on there. They had palm fronds and stuff like that, right? Stuff that they could easily see through some kind of a gap or something to see, oh, hey, the fire is moving. Let's pack it up and go. We got to go. We got to move. God is telling us through this fire to move. We see how light now also becomes part of this ceremony. And let's read about Jesus being the light. So in verse 12, Jesus spoke to the people once more and said, so he's continuing on, I am the light of the world. If you follow me, you won't have to walk in darkness, because you will have the light that leads to life. The Pharisees replied, you are making those claims about yourself. Such testimony is not valid. Again, remember, according to the Jewish law, it was not enough for you to speak on behalf of yourself. There had to be witnesses involved. We talked about this already, I believe, in chapter 7 or so, where Jesus makes some claims, and then he kind of gives this court case hearing. It might have been chapter 6. I can't remember right now. But anyway, there was this piece where Jesus is saying, okay, fine, you want some witnesses? How about John the Baptist? How about my healings and stuff? How about my Father God? He's already kind of laid this out. And now he's making another claim, and they're saying, how dare you say this? You can't say this about yourself. This is not how it works. You need some witnesses. All right. So the Pharisees replied again, verse 13. The Pharisees replied, you are making these claims about yourself. Such testimony is not valid. Jesus told them, these claims are valid, even though I make them about myself. For I know where I come from and where I am going, but you don't know this about me. You judge me by human standards, but I do not judge anyone. And if I did, my judgment would be correct. Now think about what Jesus is saying here. He is basically saying, I have the ability to judge, and if I chose to judge, it would be right. You don't have the ability to judge me because you don't understand me. You don't know where I came from. You don't know where I'm going. In fact, you don't desire to have a relationship with me whatsoever. So you are limited in your thinking right now. But Jesus is telling them, everything I am telling you is right. And I, who have the position to judge you, I'm backing down on this for a moment, because there are bigger things at hand. So let's continue. I'm going to go back to verse 16. And if I did, my judgment would be correct in every respect, because I am not alone. The Father who sent me is with me. Your own law says that if 2 people agree about something, their witness is accepted as fact. I am one witness, and the Father who sent me, and my Father who sent me is the other. So he's saying again, look, you want two witnesses according to your law? Great. Me and my Father. But again, if there's no relationship with Jesus or the Father, and it's just religion, then they're going to throw it out, saying, no, that's not how this works. Verse 19, where is your Father? They asked. Jesus answered, since you don't know who I am, you don't know who my Father is. If you knew me, you would also know my Father. Jesus made these statements, again, John's kind of giving us some narrative now. Jesus made these statements while he was teaching in the section of the temple known as the treasury. But he was not arrested because his time had not yet come. Now let's talk about that. Why is it so important for John to put the piece about the treasury in there? And I was looking, and at first I was going to just breeze over this piece when I was doing my study notes, and then I decided I'm going to dig in. I think there's got to be a reason as to why John puts specifically where this is happening. And the treasury, as I was doing some research, is the most public place. Okay, where's my notes here? No, that's not it. Oh, I made a note on this. Oh, here we go. At the treasury, the most public place in Jerusalem. All right, this is at the Temple Mount. This is where there would have been a huge crowd. All right, and Jesus is saying all these things. He's doing all this stuff with the woman that he's just talked about and said, go and sin no more. All these type things, all his teachings are specifically at the most public place that it could be in Jerusalem at this time. So think about how many people are hearing what Jesus is saying. How many people, and we're going to see in one of these other sections coming up, how many people are now believing in Jesus for what he is saying. All right. Now, I will also say, one of the problems with our modern day Bible is the way that it breaks the chapter and verse. Okay? So keep that in mind here. As we kind of look at some of these other things that are happening. If we were to read chapter 7 through chapter 8, we find that this is a continuous transaction. It's a continuous story that is taking place. If we were to probably write this to a friend, we wouldn't have made it two separate letters. We would have said, and then this is what happened, and the next day this is what happened, and this is kind of what John is doing. But here we decided, let's just make it into smaller sections, put chapter and verse in there. We don't get the full story unless we continue to read through chapter 7 into chapter 8 and continue on and get the full story of what's happening. And I think that's where we lose some of this, and maybe a good reason for John to have put is this all happened at the temple, because he's basically telling us all the stuff that just happened with Jesus teaching, and then the next day he comes back and he's at the same spot and he's teaching again. And this whole thing happened. This is a big series of events. And it happened in the most public place that it could possibly have happened at. Right? All right, so I am the light of the world, he says. All right, and then we notice that there's kind of like an if-then statement here. If you follow me, then you will not walk in darkness. Go back to where it talks about this here. Jesus spoke to the people, again this is in verse 12, spoke to the people once more and said, I am the light of the world. If you follow me, you won't have to walk in darkness. Now the word then is not in there, but you can see how this is an if-then statement. If you walk in me, if you follow me, then you won't walk in darkness. And Jesus has just declared himself as the light. In John chapter 1, verse 1, we read that Jesus is the Word. Here, we see that Jesus is the light. Now, Jesus makes a lot of different comments about himself, statements about himself that John records. But taking the Word and the light, go back to Psalm 119, 105. What does the verse say? Your Word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. David is saying, your Word, and Jesus is the Word, is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. Interesting. Coincidence? All right. This is chapter 5. I did write it down here. Chapter 5 is where Jesus gives this testimony about himself, and he says, John the Baptist. This is after he had healed the guy at the pool of Bethesda. John the Baptist, my miracles and things that I'm doing, and then God himself stands up for me. And what I say about myself, Jesus says, is valid. While Jesus, what Jesus says, I don't know what I wrote on that. All right. Jesus points out, I'll move to the next note. Jesus points out that he was qualified to give a testimony about himself because he knew where he came from. He knew where he was going. Per the flesh, he was born in Galilee, so they keep continuing to get stuck again in the physical part here. And to some extent, they don't really believe that Jesus could be the Messiah because they keep getting stuck on this physical parent thing. And we'll see this again in just a little bit. All right? But per the flesh, yes, he was born in Galilee, so they saw him as only human, and they're judging him by human standards. But Jesus is saying, you don't know where I come from. Right? You have this limited perspective because you saw Mary coddling me, rocking me, and all this type of stuff, and you saw Joseph there as my physical father. You think that I am from physical people. They were not understanding or maybe not accepting the fact that there was a virgin birth involved here. Right? But Jesus is saying, look, I know where I came from. And why would he not know? He's the Son of God. He knows exactly where he came from. He knows the whole story. He was in on it before it ever actually took place. Right? He understood his part in the role of redemption. And so he's saying, I know who I am. You don't know who I am. I know where I came from. You don't understand where I came from. All right? And then they say, well, where is your father? Because again, they're thinking, dude, you came from Joseph. Although it might have been a little shady kind of relationship, right? But Jesus is saying, no, that's not how this works. You don't know me because you don't know him. And if you knew him, then you would know who I am. You got to get past that limited thinking. And this just takes us right into verse 21. So let's pick it up from there. Later, Jesus said to them again, I am going away. You will search for me, but you will die in your sin. You cannot come where I am going. Now, this is a very hard statement because Jesus is basically just saying, look, you're going to die in your sin. What is the sin that he's referring to? Everything. And because they don't have a relationship with him, they don't understand that what they are doing is wrong. They're judging themselves based on the law of Moses. And over the course of time, we've said this before, over the course of time, the law of Moses has really been skewed and has been rewritten with man-made laws that have nothing to do with what the original law was supposed to be. They're putting almost prison chains on people saying you must live like this and this and this and this, making it hard for anyone to find any freedom, anything except oppression. And Jesus is basically saying here, look, you're going to die in your sin. But if you choose to follow me, if you choose to have a relationship with me, then there can be a different outcome. Verse 22, the people asked, is he planning to commit suicide? What does that mean? You cannot come where I am going. Jesus continued, you are from below, I am from above. You belong to this world, I do not. That is why I said that you will die in your sins, for unless you believe that I am who I claim to be, you will die in your sins. Folks, this is no different than the situation that we have today. If we don't truly have a relationship with Jesus, if we are not obeying him and walking in his ways, we decide instead that we are going to live in sin, then no matter how many times you cry out, unless there is that relationship with him, you will die in your sin. And they're thinking he's talking about suicide, right? Well, here's the problem with that. Suicide is not at all what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about, look, there is an acceptance of me that opens up the door for that eternal life. This is nothing new. Jesus has been talking about this for a while now, pointing out the fact that eternal life is based on having a relationship with Him. He offers this. We saw this all the way back in John 3:16. For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, that whosoever believes in Him will not perish but have everlasting life. So Jesus has been offering this eternal, everlasting life if there is belief in Him. But again, He's pointing out, you don't believe me. Unfortunately, you're not going to get the benefit of believing in me. You will perish in your sins, because this everlasting life is offered to those who believe in me. For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish. These people are about to perish. Verse 25, who are you? They demanded. Jesus replied, I am the one I have always claimed to be. I have much to say about you and much to condemn, but I won't. So Jesus is saying, look, I look through. I can see your heart. And your heart is black. You don't believe in me. You're stuck in your sins. You're doing things that are contrary to a real relationship with me. Man, I wonder how many of us Jesus speaks this to. I have much to say about you and much to condemn, but I won't. For I say only what I have heard from the one who sent me, and He is completely truthful. But they still didn't understand that He was talking about His Father. Again, they don't understand that He's talking about about God, but also about the relationship that has to happen. In verse 28, so Jesus said, when you have lifted up the Son of Man on the cross, then you will understand that I am He. I do nothing on my own, but say only what the Father taught me. And the one who sent me is with me. He has not deserted me, for I always do what pleases Him. Then many who heard Him say these things believed in Him. Now this is a point of rejoicing right here, because what we are finding is as Jesus is speaking, it's getting through to some people. And they're understanding, wait a minute. This eternal life comes only through a relationship with Him. And they start to believe. And this is just one piece here where we're going to find that there is some belief happening. But it's a moment of joy. All right, let's take a look at this last bit here. Starting in verse 31. Jesus said to the disciples who believed in Him, you are truly my disciples if you remain faithful to my teachings, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. How many times have we heard this verse? The truth will set you free. Do we understand the context of this verse? All right, because it's very important for us to not just throw out some words, but to actually understand the context of what is being said. So, again, let's start with this other if-then statement that might not be coming out as one, but truly it is one. In verse 31, Jesus said to the disciples who believed in Him, you are truly my disciples if you remain faithful to my teaching. We could also kind of pose it this way. If you remain faithful to my teaching, then you are truly my disciples. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Okay. Let's talk about some of these words. Faithful. Jesus says, you are my disciples if you remain faithful. Faithful, it means to abide. It means to stay in me continuously, to stay present, to tarry, to stand. All right? So you are truly my disciples if you remain faithful to my teachings. What are the teachings he's referring to? The ideas, the logic, the speech. The actual word is logos. So think about those two words and ask yourself, am I truly one of his disciples? Am I abiding? Am I being faithful to him and in his teachings? All right? So, then we get this verse 32, the truth will set you free. We have to know the truth to be set free. By abiding, we know the truth and we become free. We know, the word know is the word genisko in the Greek there. This is a very intimate word. It is taking in the knowledge. It is a realization. All right, so by abiding, we know the truth. We are going to understand the truth. We're going to comprehend it. We're going to realize it. And in such, we become liberated. We become, as the Greek word says here, I was looking this up, this fascinated me. It says exempt from liability. Notice how it is so important for us to have this relationship with him, to abide in him, to walk out his teachings. And in so, we're going to know the truth. We're going to move in the truth. And that truth is going to keep us liberated, keep us exempt from liability. So these aren't words we just want to throw around. Understand exactly what they're saying. There is power in this. There is power in understanding, especially verse 31. Being a true disciple and remaining faithful to his teachings. Verse 33. But we are descendants of Abraham, they said. We have never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean we will be set free? You know, we talked in the last session about how they didn't think that any good prophet came from Galilee, and then we found out, hey, Jonah did, right? This is, again, one of those statements where I'm like, this is a foot-in-the-mouth statement. You're saying that you have never been slaves to anyone. They must not understand the history of their own people, because that's the false statement. If they're talking about we are descendants of Abraham, if we start just at Abraham and go to the present time, here's all the places you've been slaves to. History shows that they were slaves to Egypt, to the Philistines, to Babylon, to Persia, to Syria, and now to Rome. And they're going to make a statement saying we've never been slaves to anyone? That doesn't make any sense. All right, 33 again. But we are descendants of Abraham, they said. We have never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean you will be set free? Jesus replied, I tell you the truth. Everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now, he's not talking about their physical slavery. He's talking about their spiritual slavery. I tell you the truth. Everyone who sins is a slave to sin. A slave is not a permanent member of the family, but a son is part of the family forever. I was reading through this again last night, and you know what struck me? The story about the prodigal son in Luke. Because he had the status of son, but because he messed up, he said, maybe I'm worthy enough to be a slave in my father's house. And he gets there, and the father says, no, what are you doing? You're my son. So think about this again as we read this part here. A slave is not a permanent member of the family, but a son is of the family forever. When that prodigal son, when his father took him back, he said, no, you're not a slave, you are a son. And Jesus is saying, look, be part of my family, not a slave. Don't be a slave to sin. Be part of my family. Verse 36, so if the Son sets you free, you are truly free. Again, this is another one of those verses we hear a lot, right? But understand the depth of it. The freedom he's talking about is a freedom from sin. And if Jesus has set you free, and we know he's going to by his act on the cross, but if he sets you free, then you are free indeed. So if the Son sets you free, you are truly free. Yes, I realize that you are descendants of Abraham, and yet some of you are trying to kill me because there's no room in your hearts for my message. I am telling you what I saw when I was with my Father. But you are following the advice of your father. Oh, this is another great comment. As I was reading this, I'm like, whoa, this one's good. All right, I promise I'm trying to get through this in time, but there's some good stuff in here right now. Jesus is saying, look, I follow the advice of my heavenly Father. You, however, follow the advice of your earthly father, who followed the advice of his earthly father, who his earthly father, his earthly father. You have all these earthly father lineages that have been skewed since the beginning because you keep adding your own thing, your own fatherly advice in here. So you're listening to the advice of your father. You're listening to the teachings and the ways that you were raised in from your father, but it's not the direct link that I have kept with my Father. All right, 38 again. I am telling you what I saw when I was with my father, but you are following the advice of your father. Our father is Abraham, they declared. No, Jesus replied. For if you were really the children of Abraham, you would follow his example. Instead, you are trying to kill me because I told you the truth, which I heard from God. Abraham never did such a thing. No, you are imitating your real father. What he is saying is, look, Abraham didn't live this way that you are acknowledging and accepting. That's something that you got from your own father. This moral compass that started out so well has skewed, and those are the things that you are following. And those, unfortunately, are the things that are leading you into this sinful lifestyles. And again, Jesus is calling out the sinful pieces now. Verse 41 again. No, you are imitating your real father. They replied, we aren't legitimate children. God himself is our true father. Now, why would they make that comment? Again, a lot of theologians believe that they made that comment because of Jesus. Some of them, most of them, because they did not understand, and this was kind of the point that Jesus was making, because they didn't understand him, they didn't know him, and they didn't know God, they didn't understand that Jesus actually was from the virgin birth. They were looking at more as if Joseph and Mary, Joseph had kind of knocked up Mary prior to the wedding, and so now, you are an illegitimate child, Jesus, but not us. Oh, well, no, we are descendants of Abraham. We have done things the right way. We're not so sure about, All right, so going back to 41 again. No, you are imitating your real father. They replied, we are legitimate children. God himself is our true father. And then Jesus speaks up here in verse 42. Jesus told them, if God were your father, you would love me, because I have come to you from God. I am not here on my own, but he sent me. Again, he's making that relationship. Hey, look, if you really understood, it almost sounds as if Jesus is a broken record, right? But he's having to stand up for himself, for the ways of God. He is standing up and declaring, look, if you just understood who I am, if you just had relationship with me, if your eyes were open and you saw all this stuff in the realness of what it is, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Because you would be a believer. You would know me, but the problem is you don't know me. All right. 43. Why can't you understand what I'm saying? It's because you can't even hear me. For you are the children of your father, the devil, and you love to do the evil things he does. He was a murderer from the beginning. He has always hated the truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, it is consistent with his character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So when I tell you the truth, you just naturally don't believe me. And since I am telling you the truth, why don't you believe me? Anyone who belongs to God listens gladly to the words of God, but you don't listen because you don't belong to God. Again, he continues to say the same thing, and this time he's called them liars. He's basically just said, look, let's talk about your father versus my father. All right, verse 44, I wrote these notes down. Yeah. Religious leaders brought up Jesus' parentage by insulting him, so Jesus brings up theirs by explaining that they were children of the devil. They hate the truth. The devil hates the truth, right? You hate me, and you do not see the truth that I am speaking of. He is a liar, and you too are spreading lies. You're deceiving others. So yes, you are a great representation of your father, as am I a great representation of my father. Come into my family line is basically what Jesus is saying. But you choose not to. You choose not to listen. You choose not to make that action. You choose to continue to stay where you are. In verse 48, the people retorted, "You Samaritan devil! Didn't we say all along you were possessed by a demon?" Now, this is basically their way of, in frustration, and as a teacher, I run into this sometimes too, where I'm trying to explain something, and I'm a math teacher on the side, right? So I'm trying to explain something, and for one reason or another, the student is not paying attention, not listening. Maybe they're goofing off, maybe they are half asleep, I don't know. But I continue to tell them the things, and they come back at me and say, "You're not a good teacher." Well, hold on a second. I'm not the one who's falling asleep in class, right? I'm not the one who keeps talking. I'm not the one who's making every attempt not to listen by doing what you shouldn't be doing, right? And then they begin to do the name-calling thing. "Oh, Mr. Tichota, you're this. You don't care." They come out with these retortions. They come out with the name callings and all this type of stuff. And this is the same thing that's happening here with Jesus. They are getting frustrated, and they're basically saying, "You are a Samaritan devil. You Samaritan devil." Why would they use those words? Well, again, the Samaritans, as we've learned, were the low-class half-breeds, right? So that was, you don't want to be a Samaritan. That means you're not really Jewish. That means that you're some kind of a mixed person, right? And then obviously calling him a devil. What? Okay. Anyway, I thought that was kind of funny when I was reading through this. All right, so again, in verse 49 now, it says, "No," Jesus said, "I have no demon in me, for I honor my Father, and you dishonor me." As a math teacher, it's the same thing. No, wait, don't get mad at me. Don't get mad at me because you're falling asleep. Don't get mad at me because you talked through the lesson. I have done what I was supposed to do. The principal has entrusted me to teach you this lesson. I have taught you this lesson. But you chose not to listen. And Jesus is saying the same thing. I have no demon in me, for I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. And though I have no wish to glorify myself, God is going to glorify me. He is the true judge. I tell you the truth, anyone who obeys my teachings will never die. Again, if I relate this to school, I could say, look, the principal could be in this class, and she could tell you that I'm teaching you exactly, especially my principal. She's a math teacher, a former math teacher. So she could explain to you that what I've taught you is right. Right? And if you just listen to what I'm saying, I guarantee you would get a better grade on the test. It basically was what Jesus is saying here. Where are we? Let me read it again. Verse 50. And though I have no wish to glorify myself, God is going to glorify me. He is the true judge. I tell you the truth, anyone who obeys my teachings will never die. The people said, now we know you are possessed by a demon. Even Abraham and the prophets died, but you say, anyone who obeys my teaching will never die. Are you greater than our father Abraham? He died, and so did the prophets. Who do you think you are? Again, they are just frustrated because they're getting put in place by every comment that they make. Jesus answered, if I want glory for myself, it doesn't count. But it is my Father who will glorify me. You say, He is our God, but you don't even know Him. I know Him. If I said otherwise, I would be as great a liar as you. But I do know Him and obey Him. Your father Abraham rejoiced as he looked forward to my coming. He saw it and was glad. The people said, You aren't even 50 years old. How can you say that you have seen Abraham? We're going to end with this. Jesus answered, I tell you the truth. Before Abraham was even born, I am. At that moment they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus was hidden from them and left the temple. In this one chapter, chapter 8, the phrase I am has come up 3 times. We see it in verse 24, verse 28, verse 58. This is a title reserved for Yahweh himself. And it says here that they took up stones because they were going to stone him. This relates to the leaders now understanding that Jesus, what Jesus was saying. They felt his words were worthy of death. There's a twinge in there now, past the frustration, where they're beginning to realize what he is saying, and they're offended by it. And they're going to take up stones and attempt to stone him, but it says that he disappears in the crowd. He's hidden from them. But here's the final note that I want to bring to your attention, or I want to ask you, I guess. Where are you in relation to what we've just read? Are you one who does not have a relationship with Jesus and is ready to pick up stones and throw it at him? Or are you one, like we saw earlier, where you believe in him and you are understanding who he really is? Man, I hope that as we've gone through this chapter here today, you've kind of seen that sin is a serious thing. And Jesus, in pardoning the woman in the adulterous affair, he wasn't saying, hey, it's okay to sin, because what did he say? He said, go and sin no more. Stop this action. I hope that as we read through this today, you see, maybe in yourself, I got this sin that I got to stop. I got to stop this action. We're all there. At some point, either we have been there, we are there now, we're going to be there. We're going to have to make this decision for ourselves. Am I going to stop sinning, or am I going to let that sin be what demolishes me? And if Jesus confronts us, are we going to pick up the stones, get all mad, huffy, and call names? Or are we going to accept that why he's telling us this is because we truly are in need of a relationship with him, an understanding? I guess we could even ask from earlier bits there, are we walking as real disciples? Are we abiding in him? Are we doing as his word says? These are all questions we need to ask ourselves. This isn't just a chapter to breeze over. John put this in here for a reason. It's a challenge to us. Not only do we see how Jesus is acting when his accusers are coming after him, but it should open our eyes to realize, wait a minute. Where am I in this story? Am I the believer? Am I the sinner? Am I the one trying to stone Jesus? Where do I need to be in this story? So I'm going to leave that with you today. I'm here for you. Hey, you know what? You can send me an email anytime. I'll be more than happy to pray with you, pray for you. Drop me a message. But I'm here. I'll see you next week. God bless.